Today, we become legends.
Throughout the over a decade of Smite we've had so far, many gods weren't born with their assigned class. Some might have been designated a warrior, but they felt like an assassin on the inside, and that's what counts. Therefore, quite a few gods have changed class since their initial release, and this video will cover a brief overview of why these gods changed. Be that general playstyle, a complete kit rework, or something else. So let's jump in.
Cupid!
So Cupid is an interesting one, since as far as I know, he's the only god to have changed class twice during his existence. In closed beta version 0.1.1215 in December 2012, roughly 4 months after his initial release as a hunter, Cupid was changed to be a mage and his abilities all dealt magical damage. His basic attack still dealt physical because that's how all basic attacks worked way back in early beta. Regardless of damage type, your basic attacks dealt physical damage and you could build any item. Interestingly, Cupid's power scalings were increased dramatically on this change, which you would expect to be the opposite given magical power is easier to come by in larger amounts than physical power is. But perhaps this was different back in 2012. This mage Cupid didn't last long, however, as he was changed back to a hunter dealing all physical damage only 3 weeks after the change in late December 2012. In the early days of the game, a lot more was being experimented with in bigger ways before Smite established its core identity, and so there are quite a few instances such as this that were almost instantly reverted.
Guan Yu.
Next up is Guan Yu, who I'm sure most of you have already heard about his original Guardian design, as it was hands down the most broken god to ever exist in Smite. I've got a full video covering why he was so broken in detail that you can check out, but here I'll just give a brief overview. His 1 and 2 both had the same effect they do now, where they reduced all of Guan's cooldowns by 2 seconds if they hit an ally for the heal or an enemy for the dash. However, they both had base 6-second cooldowns, meaning if you use them in succession, all of your cooldowns are reduced by 4, giving both these abilities an effective 2-second cooldown. At 40% CDR, the base cooldown goes to 3.6 seconds, and so if you built max CDR, these abilities literally did not have a cooldown as long as you were healing allies and damaging enemies respectively. His 3 was also pretty infamous. It was the same as now but did magical damage, but the kicker was that it dealt 600 base plus 200% magical scaling. In his warrior iteration, this ability already hits insanely hard, but 200% of magical power is more than most mage ultimates have, and 600 base damage is also no slouch for a Guardian ability. His ultimate was the only completely reworked ability in his transition to a warrior, and basically his old ult was Amaterasu's current ult but way better. It was repurposed later on for Armor's release. Like most of Guan's kit, this thing hit like a truck for no reason. The total damage for all 3 hits was 900 plus 135% magical power. That might not seem too crazy, but keep in mind this guy was a Guardian and this ability also silenced for 2 seconds and then stunned for 2 seconds while being damn near unmissable. Oh, and keep in mind that his 1 and 2 have an effective minus 0.4 second cooldown at max CDR and are also reducing the ult and 3 by 2 seconds every time they're cast. So in practice, this ult had something like a 30-second cooldown if you were fighting a lot. Yeah, all in all, every aspect of Guardian Guan was completely and utterly busted bar his passive, which was just bonus protections when near structures. Naturally, something needed to be done about this, and despite a lot of nerfs, Guan was reworked into a warrior in August 2013, sadly only 4 months before I started playing. He kept mostly the same kit except his new passive and ultimate of course, and his numbers were across the board rebalanced. Hey, if you're watching this video in the first few hours, I'm live over on Twitch at the moment if you want to come say hi, watch me play some Smite. But yeah, back to the video.
Hades.
Moving on to one of the more recent class changes, but still many years ago, we have Hades. Since his release, Hades was always a more aggressive, damage-focused Guardian that saw next to no play in support and was mainly only viable in solo. His class change to a mage in the Season 3 launch patch only made sense, and while nothing major about him was changed, his base stats were adjusted accordingly, and the team could now balance him as a mage rather than trying to walk this tightrope of not allowing him to have too much base damage because he was a Guardian. Honestly, this change was more for clarity than gameplay, since, as I said, barely anything changed for him beyond base stats, and he still to this day is only really popular in solo lane with the very occasional off-meta stint in mid. He is, however, built with more damage now than he used to be, so I guess it did have some impact.
Nemesis.
Nemesis is one of a few warriors that became assassins after their release, and of all of them, the rest of which we'll get in a second, I think the class change fits Nemesis best. Her kit, which didn't change, always gave off major assassin vibes with how all in she is, and while Nemesis was a pretty broken release, that's not the reason for her reclassification. She just fit much better into the assassin class identity and playstyle. Her base stats were adjusted to match the class, but other than that, not really much change for Nem. She was already being built as an assassin for the most part, which just emphasized the obvious shift that she was given. Ravan, though, is a more interesting case of a warrior becoming an assassin. Not only because his kit was semi-reworked long before the change to an assassin, but also because Ravan at the moment is strongest when played full tank as a warrior from solo lane. And even before this meta, tanky Ravan was absolutely viable for many years. With this recent meta, there have been calls to revert this change and turn Ravan back into a warrior. I won't spend too long on his release warrior kit because, as I mentioned, he remained a warrior for a long time after his rework, so there was clearly some indecisiveness on the team on whether he should remain a warrior or become an assassin. But his original ultimate was a lock-on jump instead, which linked Ravan to his target, massively reducing damage taken from other enemies. His passive was used to boost the next cast of his 1 instead of the shield it is now, and his 2 had damage immunity but not CC immunity on launch. In early Season 2, he was reworked into his modern design with a few additional changes later in Season 3, but it took until Season 5 to finally reclassify him, which, as I said, shows a bit of indecision from the team on the direction they wanted to go in for Ravan. And this is one of the class changes that I'm unsure was a good idea overall. I think it's fine to have warriors that are viable with more damage and in the jungle, and making him an assassin has the same problem but flipped, as we now see most of his success building like a warrior from solo lane. What do you guys think about this one? Are you on the hashtag revert Ravan train, or do you think he makes more sense as an assassin?
Sun Wukong.
So just a very quick one here for Wukong that I don't really think even falls under a class change specifically, but Wukong's original kit was what Hunbats has now, and he was an assassin. When that kit was given to Hunbats, he was rekitted as a warrior. That's all there is to say about this one.
Thor.
Thor is the third and final warrior that became an assassin. Much like Nemesis, Thor didn't undergo any kit changes during the reclassification, just some base stat changes. And while for Nemesis I think it fit perfectly to be an assassin, and for Ravan I think he probably should have stayed a warrior, for Thor I'm indifferent. I think his playstyle can fit both classes extremely well depending on the build and player using him, which is probably indicative of a great god design. Though thematically I do feel like he belongs in the warrior class. His game plan can go either way though, and probably leans slightly more towards an assassin. This warrior to assassin move is the most common class change, which I think embodies the larger issue of these two classes being too similar in ways. For which I personally would like to see a fighter or brawler class where you could move the most tanky or bruiser assassins like Ravan, Thor, Fenrir and Lancelot, as well as the more damage leaning warriors that often see jungle play like Erlang, Achilles, Gilgamesh, Osiris and maybe Vamana. This new fighter class could better embody the playstyle of these assassins and warriors that blur the line between the two classes, and you could focus more on making assassins true assassins and warriors true warriors.
Vulcan.
But moving on to our final official class change, more on that in a second, we have Vulcan, who way back in 2013 received a significant rework that changed him from a guardian focused almost entirely around his turrets, to a burst mage that just happens to have a turret. His Inferno Cannon still existed back then, along with another turret on his 3 which is now Magma Bomb. This Stumper turret did pulsing AoE damage around it in a circle and slowed enemies. His ultimate Volcanic
Overdrive
was a huge steroid that gave Vulcan increased speed and protections while increasing the fire rate and regeneration of his turrets for 6 seconds. During this, Inferno Cannon would also hit in a 360-degree radius instead of the cone it normally does. He also had a passive that gave a percentage of his health and procs to his turrets. This was a weird design and I can definitely see why it didn't work out, especially on a Guardian, as they couldn't let the turrets do too much damage or he'd be OP. I do think there's some potential to explore here though with a summoner style mage that uses pets and or turrets to do most of their damage in fights and is weaker when caught alone. Who knows, maybe someday we'll get something inspired by original Guardian Vulcan. Alright, so that's all the official class changes that have ever happened, but I have a few more bonus ones that I've gathered from a list of pre-release abilities for gods that might imply some gods were originally going to be a different class, but by the time they released, that was changed. Firstly, these Cerberus pre-release abilities all dealt physical damage, and given his quite aggressive in-your-face playstyle, I could absolutely see Cerberus being a warrior dealing physical damage instead of a guardian. Next up is Nox, who is less clear-cut than Warrior Cerberus, but given her original release kit that was more utility focused and her currently seeing more support play than mid, these pre-release abilities are pretty supportive rather than mage focused, with damage boosts and shields for allies, as well as a big AoE 2-second stun ultimate that could be used while she was inside an ally from her 3. Definitely points to Nox being originally a support at some point. This next one is pretty loose, but these abilities seem to point to Hachiman potentially being a warrior or assassin. He had a Thor passive, a parry with a knockback, and a roll that knocks up enemy gods. This is by no means concrete, and these abilities do still fit with a hunter somewhat, but they do seem a bit more warrior or assassin-like in nature. And finally, Iset is another mage that sees a fair bit of support play, and this pre-release ultimate was essentially Kali ult, but you target an ally with it. They also gain power and complete CC immunity instead of Kali that just gets root and knockback immunity. And the big kicker for this one, kills extended the duration of the ultimate. This could work for a mage, but it feels much more Guardian-like, and in combination with her already somewhat supportive kit, Iset could have just straight up been a Guardian in the early designs of her. But that's all I've got for every god that has changed class in Smite history, as well as a few bonus pre-release ones. Which ones of these do you agree or disagree with? Let me know down below, and I'll catch you guys in another one later on. Have a great day, and peace out, you nerds.